So my granddaughter Harper's here. She's our youngest granddaughter. She's 16 years old. Earlier this summer, she said, "Gramps, were you besties with the Pope?" I think that's teen lingo for best friends. So I explained to Harper that there were only 13 of us in our graduating class. We lived together for 9 months out of the year for 4 straight years. So we're all pretty tight. Well, that wasn't good enough for her. She says, "So you weren't besties." But seriously, once you spend any time with, I'm going to keep calling him Bob Prevost, that's how I remember him. He's such a genuine individual that he just makes you feel like he's your best friend. And that's the relationship that we have. So some of you were thinking, wait a minute, Dave, I just heard you talk on Annunciation Radio when Eric interviewed you. In fact, you said the same thing at the Sarah Club in June. You told us that there were 12 of you. Now it's 13. Well, remembering something after 52 years is a little bit difficult. And a week after that Annunciation Radio interview, I had the privilege of going to Chicago, and there were 7 of us got together for a round of golf, a few drinks, and dinner. And all the stories. And somebody came up with our long-lost graduation photo, and sure enough, there was 13 of us. So we're getting ready to tee off, and I hear my buddy Ken, he was always a class clown, he's bragging, he says, "Hey, do you remember that time on McIntyre's birthday that we hit his bed?" I turned around and I said, "That wasn't McIntyre, you moron, that was me." So you never wanted to let anybody know it was your birthday, because even the priest, it was always prank time. So I'm the lone guy from Ohio. Most of my classmates were from Chicago. We'll get involved in that. So that was the first time I'd seen many of my classmates for 52 years. But it was just like, you know, we just picked up where we left off. That's how close we were. They remain close because they all live in Chicago, so of course they remain close with Bob Prevost, who spent 15 years of his life in Chicago. So they would get together for weddings, baptisms, funerals, so forth and so on. So I got a lot of good information about Bob from them. Here we go, Father Eric. As soon as I saw you when we got back from Florida, you said, "So do you have any goods on the Pope?" So when we're sitting around having some cocktails, and we're talking about different mischievous things that teenagers do, I said, "How about Bob Prevost? Did he ever get in trouble?" And my buddy Wes said, "Oh, no, never." I said, "Well, then tell me, Wes, weren't you the one that used to sneak into the pantry on Saturday nights and steal a box of chocolate donuts?" He said, "Yeah, but I never got caught." And I said, "Didn't you bring those back to the dorm and share them with all of us?" "Yeah." I said, "Did Bob Prevost ever eat any of those stolen donuts?" So nobody saw him, nobody remembered everything, so he's going to keep his squeaky clean image. So I had an opportunity to write a letter to Bob. Here we go again, Father, this is the last one. So I happened to be over at St. Joe's before 6 o'clock Mass a few weeks ago, and I says, "Father, I'm struggling with this. What do you say to somebody who was a good friend in high school? You haven't seen him in 52 years, and now he's Pope." Right? I'm going to him for advice. So he thinks for a minute, and he says, "How about this?" He says, "Hey, Bob, what's new?" So seriously, it was pretty easy to write that letter, and it turned out to be a thank you letter. And the first thing I thanked him for was helping me get through high school. That's no joke, that's what really happened. And the last thing I did, I asked for a favor. I enclosed a brochure from Off the Streets. I just asked for prayers and blessing. So a saint, this is my definition, my favorite definition, is an ordinary person who does extraordinary things. And based on that definition, there's a lot of saints right here in this room. So Bob Prevost was an ordinary person when we attended high school together 52 years ago. Was he smart? Well, of course he was. But we had other classmates just as smart. He was probably the hardest working individual I've ever met. And if you talk to some of his colleagues now, they say the same thing. He's still a very hard-working individual. I remember Bob as being kind, humble, a natural-born leader who used his intelligence to help any of us get through school. So Cardinal Bob Prevost was an ordinary person when he called his older brother John the night before the conclave. He called him because they played a daily game of Wordle. And it was in that conversation he told his brother John, he said, none of the cardinals seem to know each other, but they all seem to know me. Maybe we should come up with a papal name. And they came up with Pope Leo. I truly believe that Pope Leo is still an ordinary person with a huge amount of experience which will enable him to do extraordinary things on a much grander scale. So Trish wanted me to talk about what was it like emotionally when I saw him get elected Pope. So Marty and I were on a cruise ship out in the middle of the Atlantic. And of course we were keeping an eye on the news. And at first he wasn't on any of the betting odds, he wasn't on the radar. And when it became closer to the conclave, suddenly he's in the top 10. So she gets a text, whatever, there's white smoke, so we head up to the room, we turn on the TV, and we're watching, and all of a sudden the cardinal comes out and he makes the announcement. And at first he's speaking what, Italian, Latin, something like that, and it didn't register. And then my phone pinged, and I pick it up, and it's a text from Bishop Dennis Walsh, who you'll hear about in a little bit, and it simply said, congratulations. And then, of course, he's introduced as Pope Leo. So, of course, we were excited, we were ecstatic, we were extremely proud. But then I felt a little bit of sadness. Because unlike most of us, he'll never get to retire. Right? I mean, seriously, it's a commitment for life. He'll never go out to get to. He'll never get to go out for pizza and a beer with his friends the way that he used to. So I told that to my good friend Greg, and he said, no, Dave, he said, but he's already punched his ticket to heaven. He'll have plenty of time to relax after that. So how did a boy from Toledo, Ohio, happen to go to high school with a bunch of kids from Chicago? So here's a little bit of a brief history about high school seminaries in the United States. I read one author, a former seminarian, who claimed that in 1967 there were 130 high school seminaries. By the year 2000, only 7 remained. There's only 4 today. High school seminaries became very popular in the late 50s. By the early 80s, they were going away. So those of you from Toledo, you might remember that we had 2 such seminaries right here in the Toledo area. We had Divine Word Seminary. It was on River Road, west of Perrysburg. It was run by the Divine Word Missionaries. It's now a housing development, aptly named the Sanctuary, and there is a seminary road over there. And the other seminary was a diocesan seminary, Holy Spirit Seminary. You may remember it was on the corner of Reynolds and Airport Highway. So, how many of you know Father Dave Cherney? He's associate pastor over at St. Patrick of Edderdown's. So I had heard that he was in their graduating class, so I called him. And sure enough, he was in their first graduating class. And he and I spoke, and we had similar experiences. In his class, they had 40 freshmen. 4 years later, they had 18 graduates. He was very proud of the fact that 17 went on to the major seminary, and they ended up with 4 priests. That's phenomenal. If all of these seminaries would have been cranking out 4 priests every year, they'd still be around. But the numbers were far less. So when I was in grade school, we used to get visits. A priest came in from Divine Word, a priest came in from Holy Spirit. the nuns would have all the girls leave and we'd get the seminary talk. And there were two of us in our class, Bruce Foster and I, made a weekend visit to each one of them. And that was all good. Then we get a visit from Father Dudley Day, an Augustinian, and he was recruiting for their high school seminary, which was up in Holland, Michigan. So we ended up spending a week there over the summer and instantly fell in love with it. Beautiful piece of property. We had a 1.5 mile beach right on Lake Michigan. We had sand dunes. There were football fields. There were baseball fields. Just a great experience. So that's where we ended up going. Just a little bit of a side note. I'm the youngest of 8 children. I have several of my siblings with me here today. And if you were in the Murray household, there were 2 givens. Number 1, you were going to a Catholic high school. And number 2, you were going to find a way to pay your own tuition. So my sister Ann texted the other day, David, did you have to pay your tuition? I said, well, you'll find out. Seriously, because I was going away to high school, I did not have to pay my own tuition. But at the time, the tuition at St. Augustine Seminary High School was actually less than they were paying for my brother at St. John's High School. And ours included room and board. Quite a difference. So Father David Kidd, many of you at St. Joe's heard his homily 2 weeks ago, and he was talking about what it takes to be a priest. And he mentioned 3 things: brotherhood, sacrifice, and service. And that just hit me right here. That's what our seminary high school experience was all about. And I told him that afterwards. So what does an Augustinian community look like? Community that's what the Augustinians are all about. In our community, we had 3 retired priests, 7 working priests. They were our teachers, advisors, 2 religious brothers. Brother Raymond was our school nurse. He also taught a senior psychology class, and he used to psychoanalyze some of the priests. He told us that Father Maybush, he had some disorder called pedantry, P-E-D-A-N-T-R-Y, and it was all because his mother was too strict in potty training. So Brother Fred was our maintenance man. Also drove the big yellow school bus. And something else that Brother Fred might be famous for, he played tennis. He was a tennis coach. So if I do get to talk to Bob, and I hope I do, Pope Leo, first thing I'm going to ask, did you learn to play tennis from Brother Fred? I have a feeling that it was. So when I walked out of the high school seminary, this was my biggest takeaway. I have the utmost respect for clergy. These men worked tirelessly. As seminarians, we were in a chapel every morning at 6:40. The priests were already there. Lights out for us was 10 o'clock at night. They didn't go to bed until we went to bed. Something that Pope Leo mentioned after he was elected Pope. We are the servant of the servants. And I understand that's a saying that all of the popes use, goes all the way back to Pope Gregory back in the 6th century. And it also came from St. Augustine himself. So I don't remember that the Augustinians talked to us about service, but they led it by example. And we all had a house job that we have to do. And it might be cleaning dormitories, might be cleaning bathrooms, so forth and so on. I can't tell you what I did my freshman year. My sophomore year, I was assigned to clean Father Fink's room. Now, Father Fink was one of the retired priests. He was a rock star amongst the Augustinians. The stories that they told us was that he was president of Villanova University. It burned to the ground, and he single-handedly went out and raised the funds in order to rebuild the university. Now that we can look stuff up on the internet, we know that was greatly exaggerated. He wasn't president, he was vice president. It didn't burn to the ground, but Mendel Hall burned to the ground. But nonetheless, I got to clean his room every day. So now he was a kind old man. It took him about 15 minutes to walk from where the priest room were down to the cafeteria. So I had plenty of time to clean his room after breakfast. And the first thing I did on the way to his room, I grabbed a mop and a bucket of water because I don't think his eyesight was very good. So I ended up keeping that job for 3 years. He and I got along splendidly. I especially loved Saturdays because I could spend more time doing a thorough cleaning, vacuuming, dusting, changing the sheets, and that was the time when he and I could spend some time together. So I have no idea what Bob was doing for those years, but I guarantee that he was cleaning bathrooms just like the rest of us. So in our case, we had a freshman class of about 55 students. About half of us returned as sophomores, 15 juniors, and we ended up graduating class of 13. So why did people drop like flies? It was real simple, homesick. It's awfully difficult for a 13-year-old kid to be living away from home, away from friends, away from family, and that was the biggest thing. And I remember I also got homesick. And I remember I waited till Sunday because I knew my dad would be home. So I called home. Back then we didn't have calling cards, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have enough coins, so I called collect. And my dad answers the phone. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Dad. I miss you guys. I want to talk. And his response was, do you know how much this phone call's cost? He said, don't ever do that again. So I never did it again. So the last time I gave this talk, my wife said to me, she said, don't you think you were kind of harsh on your dad? So Dad was born in 1911, so he would have been 18 years old when the Great Depression brought out. He raised 8 children on one income because moms didn't work back then. So I think we have to cut him a little break for that. So of the 13 graduates, I believe 9 of them went on to Villanova University. We ended up with 5 Catholic priests out of our class. It's phenomenal. I was asking my friends the other day, we had 5. I said, how about the class of 72? 1, 74, none. 75, none. So the fact that we had 5, that just tells you how the Holy Spirit was working in Holland, Michigan during that time frame. So the 5 that went on to become priests, Brother Rich Jacobs, he spent his entire career at Villanova University. When he wasn't teaching during the week, he was helping out at local parishes on the weekend. He's 70, he just retired. He tells me he's busier now than he ever was. Brother Mike Schweifler was from South Haven, Michigan. Unfortunately, Mike had a heart condition, had a heart transplant that he never recovered from, so he passed away in his mid-50s. Bill Lego, Father Bill Lego, had a path similar to Pope Leo. He spent 13 years at the Augustinian missions in Peru, 3 before his ordination, 10 after his ordination. So Bill Lego and I played basketball together for 4 years. It wasn't difficult to make the basketball team because there was only a handful of us that knew how to play basketball. And we weren't very good. January 27th, 1973, that was our senior year, a special day. We played our rival St. Joe Seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We ended up winning. Bill Lego sank a couple key free throws right at the end of the game. And I think that probably broke like a 20-game losing streak for us. And Coach Heiss took us all out after the game for pizza. And I had my first legal beer. That was my 18th birthday. Earlier that day, I was watching on a black and white TV Richard Nixon signing the peace papers ending the war in Vietnam. It's quite an 18th birthday. And finally, you can't talk about Bob Prevost or Pope Leo without talking about the other Bob, Bob Dodaro. They were the two smart guys in the class. So there was an internet photo going around, and you can still find it if you Google Bob Prevost ordination day. It has him pictured as a 28-year-old with two other young priests. They never mentioned the two priests, but one of them was Father Bob Dodaro. So I asked my buddy Rich, how is it that the two of them were ordained in Rome at this time, and the other three were in different places? So this is an email that Rich sent back to me. It was believed the province leadership busted up our class because we were a powerhouse of strong personalities and ideas that could prove problematic to the regime's future. 20 years later, one of those five, Bob Prevost, he ended up leading the worldwide Augustinians. Isn't that amazing how things work out? So priests from religious orders have a few different experiences than diocesan priests. Pope Francis was a Jesuit. Leo is an Augustinian. When Pope Leo was elected, he said, quote unquote, just because I'm Pope doesn't mean I'm going to give up being an Augustinian. And he hasn't. So if you really want to learn about Pope Leo, Google the Augustinians. Go to their websites. You can read all about it. And what I took away from it, there are three different pillars of being an Augustinian. Each one of these is extremely important. Number one, a deep interior life. We'll come back to that. Number two, practical love of neighbor. And number three, constant pursuit of God's truth. That's a term that I hadn't heard before I went on a retreat back in March in Florida. And we had a young man sitting at our table, and he's talking about God's truth. And I went to him the next morning to explain that to me. I'm sure some of you have heard of that. I've never heard that term. And that's pretty much, you look at any situation in the world, any social problem, this, that, or the other thing, what would God feel about this? I have to align my heart to God, and that's the way that I should feel. So when people ask me, is Pope Leo conservative? Is he progressive? I said, none of the above. He seeks God's truth. That's what he believes. So again, community is essential to the Augustinian way of life. It's a group of men living in harmony. In the 4 years of St. Augustine, I never remember any of the priests ever having a disagreement, at least that we saw. The only fight that I remember in 4 years resulted in me getting a black eye. It was on the football field, and I think it was Mike Hennigan. Evidently, I was throwing some elbows. He didn't like it, so he sucker punched me. So we got hauled into the principal's office, Father Peck, and it was real simple. What happened? Okay. Shake hands, say you're sorry, move on. But just perfect harmony. So Bob Prevost has lived in Augustinian communities since he was 14 years old. Here's a brief rundown. Of course, 4 years in Holland, Michigan. 4 years at Villanova. He graduated in 1977, along with several of his classmates. 1 year at the novitiate in St. Louis. Novitiate is a Latin word, means novice, discernment. You spend a year, is this really something that I want to do for the rest of my life? He spent 2 years at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, living in an Augustinian community. He professed his first vows at age 26, that was 1981. He went to Rome to study canon law at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas. It's called the Angelicum, very close to an Augustinian community. He was ordained in 1982 at St. Monica in Rome at the age of 27. He spent a few years teaching math at Toledo College in Chicago, another Augustinian community. He then went to the Augustinian missions in Peru at the age of 30, where he spent 13 years, and he was reunited with his good high school friend, Father Bill Lego. Now, what were the Augustinians doing in Peru? They've been there for 50 years, and they've given birth to 22 parishes, 1 hospital, and 1 Catholic university. They're still there, a very strong presence. In 1999, he was elected provincial prior of the Midwest Augustinians, based out of Chicago. 2.5 years later, he was elected to the worldwide Augustinians as provincial prior. He had various roles for the Augustinians while living in Chicago for 15 years, living in an Augustinian community. Now this is interesting. Pope Francis was elected in 2013. Bob was in Chicago. Pope Francis appointed him of Bishop of Chiclayo, Peru in 2015. So 15 years in Chicago, now he's going back to Peru. Bob tells a story. There's an interesting video. He was at a parish in New Lenox, Illinois a few years ago when he was cardinal. I just watched it yesterday for the second time, and it was interesting. When he's a cardinal giving a talk in this church, there couldn't have been more than 30, 40 people there. Some Augustinian priests, some high school classmates, some grade school classmates. I'm thinking 2 years ago when he's speaking to a sparse crowd. Isn't that interesting? So he's talking that he was planning a celebration for the Augustinians in Peru. And they're sitting around talking, and he says, he probably won't come, but let's invite Pope Francis. So he sent him a letter, and Pope Francis writes back, I'd love to come. And of course, Francis had other things going on in South America at the same time. So he visits Peru in 2018, helps them with their celebration, helps them with the liturgy. And then he said, hey Bob, do you have a minute? And they just spent some time together and they got to know each other. That's how their friendship began. So 5 years later, 2023, this is only 2 years ago, he calls, this is Bishop Bob Prevost now. He says, I have a special job for you in Rome. Would you be willing to come back? And being the faithful servant that Bishop Prevost was, he said, sure, I'd be happy to help out any way I can. He was appointed as the prefect of the dicastery of bishops. In a nutshell, his office was in charge of appointing bishops worldwide. It's a pretty powerful position. And the way that works, it really works in a grassroots, like here in the United States when they have a bishop, names are submitted, so forth and so on. They're whittled down to just a few. It goes to the Vatican. They do their due diligence. They bring it down to a list of 3. They take it to Pope Francis. Pope Francis makes a final decision. That's how we get the bishops. So think about this. Between 2023 and 2025, 2 years, he goes from bishop to archbishop to cardinal to pope. Isn't that amazing? You talk about moving up the ladder. And again, he continued to live in Augustinian communities right up until the time he was elected. So the original plan, if you've been keeping up on it, they were going to take the 3rd floor of the papal apartments, renovate them. He was going to have 4 Augustinians move in with him to create his own Augustinian community right there at the Vatican. Well, it turned out it was awfully expensive to do the renovation. And the Augustinians just recently stepped in and said, no, we don't need to do that. You have an Augustinian community right around the corner. We'll just have you join that one. So how many of you know the story of Father Dennis Walsh? I know Father Eric's hand goes up. So Father Dennis Walsh was a Redemptorist priest. He was born in Lima, Ohio. Early career, he was in the Bronx in New York. Well, he wanted to move closer to home, so he got a hold of Bishop Blair, the head of the order. He moved back to the Toledo diocese. Marty and I got to know Father Dennis Walsh when he was at St. Patrick of Heatherdown's. We became good friends. We've been on several trips with Father Dennis, both vacations and pilgrimages. We were sitting around 2 years ago discussing where our next trip was going to be. He had a seminarian living with him. He was a St. John's Adelphus at the time by the name of J. Lebecki. He said after J. Lebecki gets ordained, he's going to Rome. Why don't we go ahead and go to Rome? Jay can take us around, show us the sights. And I said, that sounds great. And while we're there, I'll get a hold of the two Bobs. They were both in Rome at the time. Go out to lunch, and maybe we'll finally get you that little bishop's hat that you've been looking for. And that's when he said the famous words, I will never become a bishop. I'm not polished enough to become a bishop. Just last summer, he got the call. He's now the Bishop of Davenport, Iowa. And by the way, J. Lebecki is now Father J. Lebecki, and along with Father Joseph Maumee, they're two of our rising stars in the Toledo Diocese, with the youngest priest. So a week before his ordination, this would have been last September, he has to go to Rome for something called Baby Bishop School. It's an actual thing. It's like a 7-day cram course on how to become a bishop. And they bring bishops in from all over the world. Well, who do you suppose is in charge of Baby Bishop School? Cardinal Bob Prevost. So when they meet, the first thing Father tells him, he says, hey, we have a mutual friend. Do you remember Dave Murray? Well, of course I do. He says, well, Dave said he never would have made it through high school without your help. And the cardinal just smiled because he knew it was true. So Bishop Dennis Walsh described Cardinal Bob Prevost as being very quiet, very serious. This is what I believe. We're going to go back to the first of the three pillars of being an Augustinian. That's a deep interior life. I believe that our new pontiff is a very holy man with a very special gift. Matthew Kelly can say it better than I can. This was in one of his books. These are prerequisites for developing a rich inner life. There's that term again. Silence and solitude. Learn to be comfortable in your own company. Learn to enjoy silence. Many of you will remember this passage from the Old Testament. The prophet Elijah went out looking for God. In doing so, he experiences a powerful wind, an earthquake, and a fire. But God's presence is not found in any of these dramatic events. Instead, God reveals himself in a gentle breeze or a still, small voice. If you stop by the Adoration Chapel at St. Joe's Maumee, there's a very small, discreet sign. It hangs directly above the Blessed Sacrament, below the crucifix. It simply reads, "Be still and know that I am God." That's who I believe our new pontiff is. So before we get to a few photos that I brought, when I was interviewed for the article in the Toledo Blade, Sarah, one of the questions she asked me, what was the one piece of advice that Bob Prevost gave you? Kind of stuck with you. And I had to think about it. And there was none. We were classmates. We were friends. Friends typically don't give advice to other friends, at least not when you're in high school. We were all like sponges, soaking up the wisdom passed on by the Augustinians. Our Latin teacher, Father Maybush, if he told us this once, he said it 1,000 times. And this message rings clear even now, as it did when I was a teenager. Always striving, never arriving. Seems simple, doesn't it? We're always trying to do the right thing. Matthew Kelly would always say, we're striving to be the best version of ourselves that we can be. But because of our humanity, we're constantly falling, aren't we? So what do we do when we fall? We just get back on our horse and we try again. We as Catholics are so blessed to have the sacrament of reconciliation, which helps us with that process. Now I think we have a few photos. Let's see if Greg's technology works. There we go. That's a picture of Bob when he was a freshman. That was a picture of the tennis team. Notice the pocket protector? He was all business. So we used to have what's called a gaudeamus. We had to put on a gaudeamus every year. Gaudeamus is Latin for let us rejoice, for our youth will not remain. So there's a scene from Julius Caesar where Pope Leo is being stabbed by Brutus, played by Dennis Walsh. On with that theme, at least the first 2 years, Bob Prevost dressed up as one of the Augustinian monks. He's shown there with Rich Jacobs, who's another priest. Notice the fake sideburns? They were making fun of our English teacher, Father Sheridan, who was a great guy. We absolutely loved him, but he was also fun to poke fun at. So I sent that picture to Rich after Bob became Pope, and he responded, I'm still wearing black, and Bob is now dressed in white. So there's the real Father Sheridan, drinking a bottle of Sprite or Fanta or something. And there's Bob standing next to him with the sideburns and the shades. I think we were sophomores at the time. There's the debate team. And I think Bob was a freshman on the debate team. You had to be handpicked to be on the debate team. Only the smart kids got to be on the debate team. I was never invited. But a story that I will share with you, I think we were juniors, maybe seniors. We also had a speech team. A speech team, we went to different high schools for districts, regional, states. You participated in serious reading, humorous reading, impromptu speaking, and something called a group reading. Well, Bob came to me and said, Dave, would you like to be on my team? So, of course. And there were maybe 5 of us. And when you're involved with something with Bob Prevost, you just sit back and let him do all the planning, right? You're along for the ride. And the theme of our talk, it had to do with the ugliness of war, right? A lot of terrible stuff goes on in war. And the 5 of us were standing up at the front, and we all had a piece to read. I have no idea what we were reading. Knowing Bob, it might have been War and Peace, who knows? But at the end of it, how many of you remember the song, Where Have All the Flowers Gone by Peter, Paul, and Mary? So the 5 of us are up there singing that a cappella. And at the end of every verse, the one on the end would close his eyes, bow his head as portraying that we're dying. And then eventually we're all gone. It was a masterpiece, right? This was Bob's idea. So I remember either the districts or the regions, we go through this, we perform it flawlessly, we get all done, you go to the awards announcements, and like the top 2 teams would move on to the next level. We're waiting for our name to be called, and they never called our name. It's like we were devastated. On the way back to Holland in the school van at Father Sheridan, so he shared with us the judges' results, and there was one judge gave us the lowest scores possible. And that's when we learned something. That was right at the tail end of the Vietnam War. Now, I didn't know the difference between a conservative or a progressive, between a hawk or a dove. But obviously, one of the judges took offense to it. So good memories about that. There's our infamous class photo. So I'm up in the upper left-hand corner. You see me holding that cute little 3-year-old girl? That's my niece, Amy, who's with us tonight. So I caught a little bit of flack for that. I think I was just caught up in the moment. I was so excited to see her. But when I saw my classmates a few years ago and they get out of the car, the first question they asked, how's your niece? And we all got a good chuckle out of it. So there's a blow-up. Pope Leo, Bob Prevost, right in the front. surrounded by two other priests, Father Bill Lego and Father Rich Jacobs. I know you're going to notice the slacks. And if you look carefully, they're bell bottoms. That was the style back then. And then in the back row, here's our other two priests, Father Mike Schweifler on the left and Bob Dodaro. So I should have told you a little bit more about Bob Dodaro. He was an academic, where Pope Leo was more of a pastoral background. Bob Dodaro spent his entire time at the Augustinium, with an M on the end of it. It's a major seminary for the Augustinians in Rome. Spent his whole career there as a professor. He was a teacher there. He's currently in an Augustinian community up near Toronto, Canada. And still to this day, he's researching the life of St. Augustine. How much can you learn about a saint who lived back in the 5th century? That's what he's doing, so that's Bob. But I'm in the bottom left, surrounded by 4 priests, including Pope Leo. Very, very, very honored. So I have a final story to tell about Bob. And sometimes I get emotional when I tell this story. When I was a senior in high school, Father Sterneman came to me. And he asked me if I'd be willing to teach a catechism class to the 7th and 8th graders at St. Peter's School. And of course I said yes, right? How could you not? And I still remember every Friday night. I can tell you what classroom we were in. I can tell you what desk we were sitting at. And every Friday, Bob would help me prepare my lesson plans. And I guess how can you write a script like that? So I found it ironic that when I needed help in English, algebra, anything else, I went to the two Bobs. But when I needed help in my spirituality, I turned to Bob Prevost. So I guess I'm living proof that at the age of 17, he was mentoring people. So let's go back to Father Dave Cherney, who's over at St. Pat's. In our conversation, he told me that most former seminarians, they continue on, they're very active in their Catholic parishes. And I kind of already knew that. So I've been active in any parish we've been at ever since high school. Marty has been right there with me for 50 years. So we got involved in Off the Streets 4 years ago. And just the stories that Mike Lasky is telling, the stories that Greg and Pat told, it's unbelievable. And I've got a few stories to share, but I don't want to take up much of your time. There was a lady that we met over at the Westmore Apartments over in Burn Road. My grandfather used to live there. And when I walked in, the only thing she had was an inflatable bed and a TV. And in the corner was a group of pictures. I said, "Are those family members?" She said, "Yes, my family completely disowned me because of the poor decisions I made in my life. Now that I got help from 2 doctors, her family doctor and a doctor at the Arrowhead Rehabilitation Center, I got my life back together and my family is back with me." Then on the wall was a group of crosses, religious crosses. I said, "What's up with that?" She said, "When I hit my lowest point, I completely surrendered myself to God. And without his help, I couldn't have made it back." So that hit me. I'm a big fan of Bishop Robert Barron. I've seen most of his video series. I listen to his Sunday homilies. He's constantly talking about how we have to completely surrender ourselves to God. Well, I have difficulty with that, and I think it's because my life is too comfortable. I've never hit rock bottom. I don't have to worry about where my next meal is coming from. So I learned quite a bit from that lady. And Greg was telling me when they delivered the furniture, they hung the crucifix on the opposite wall of all of her crosses. So earlier this summer, Mark Krebs and I made a visit to a lady, some high-rise apartments near downtown. And the first thing that she told us, she'd been clean for 6 months. And when we get done with every visit, just like you saw in the videos, we asked, would you be open to praying with us? So she had a friend there, so the 4 of us held hands and we prayed. And we got done praying and she said, you know, when Jesus was here, he used to hang out with people just like me. Mark and I looked at each other and it's like, Joseph, Father Eric, you guys give the best homilies in the world. But until you hear it from somebody on the streets, somebody in that position, it just takes on a whole new meaning. So 2 weeks ago, Mike Durbin and I visited a lady at the YWCA down on Jefferson Avenue. She had 2 children, a 17-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old daughter. We didn't meet them. They were at school that particular day. And we have a neat little computer program now, and Mike Durbin has it on his phone. And he's going through the list. Would you like a coffee maker, toaster, microwave? We started in the kitchen. And I'm just standing back observing. And I see her eyes are a little bit watery. Well, maybe she has a cold. Maybe she has some sinuses. Pretty soon, a single tear. And those of you that know me, I can't keep my mouth shut. So I think I said something like, that better be a happy tear. And as she said yes, she just burst out. She completely lost it. Scrambling for some tissues, I think she used some toilet paper. So think about it from her perspective. First, she gets a phone call from a guy named Ed. Said, we made your security deposit. You're good to move in. Next thing you know, a guy named Dave calls her and says, when can we meet? The next day, Dave shows up with a guy named Mike, and they want to give us a whole apartment full of furnishings. No judgment, no strings attached. And we call those an aha moment. You can call it a moment, an encounter with the Holy Spirit. I'm thinking from her perspective, maybe she's thinking of it as a miracle. It's just absolutely amazing what this organization does. So the stories, the tears, it just... Again, the Blade reporter said, how long do you plan on doing this? For the rest of my life. Why would I do anything else? And that's the way all of us volunteers feel. So with that, I would like to personally thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for wanting to learn about Pope Leo. And mostly, thank you for all you do to support our ministry. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you.